So welcome, Melanie. Welcome, everybody. It's really great to see some new faces today. I would like to say this is in conversation, so I'll start off with Melanie, but please do just join in, ask Melanie or me or anyone questions and do comments. Melanie, I wondered if I could just tell you a bit about an experience that was pivotal for me, and in a sense my eco-conversion, and perhaps ask you a bit about your own. 2 years ago I went to my first CCA meeting, and I'm now quite active in the Sheffield CCA, Christian Climate Action Group, but I've kept my roots firmly in Green Christian, which is a conversation in itself. And at that meeting, John Swales was speaking, but the pivotal moment was not at the meeting, it was on the way. I would normally just get a train from where I live in Sheffield to Leeds, and I'd get a tram down to this train station, but I'd been delayed at work, I was running late, I had to get to this meeting, it was really important to me, and I had to get the train, and so I jumped in a taxi, and the taxi driver had Bengali radio on, and at that moment the Bangladesh envoy or ambassador to the United Nations was speaking about climate refugees and climate-caused migration, and that was more real than anything I'd heard up until that point. This was happening now to real people. So that was such an eco-conversion moment for me. And so I wondered if you yourself have had any eco-conversion moments that you could tell us about.
Yeah, so mine was really similar. My background doesn't lead me into activism. I regularly describe myself as a really reluctant activist. And I remember very dramatically on my 58th birthday, come back from a holiday in Venice, and I'd flown on an aeroplane, done all those sorts of things that so many of us do. And that morning I read an article, and I think it might have even been in the New York Times, and it was about how glacial melt was affecting people in the Andes, and it was particularly poignant because people were sharing limited unpoisoned water, and that sharing story really had an impact on me. And I happened to walk, I'm a lawyer, and I was on my way to court in a business suit, on my way back actually, and I saw this Extinction Rebellion protest going over the bridge, and I had been really suspicious because as a lawyer, XR had a reputation in the press of being anarchists and disruptive. But I saw people being arrested, and I just stopped and was a bit nosy. And there was this just irresistible sense that I should be on the other side of the police lines. I could only say that God was talking to me in that moment, not audibly, but just in my emotions. And I walked through those lines, and I have never stopped, because it was like the scales fell from my eyes. I realised that actually the climate crisis amplified social problems that we've all worked for, and all those sort of things that we think about in terms of poverty and alleviating these problems. And it is just so connected. And so mine was a bit of a road to Damascus moment, because that changed my entire life. I worked part-time, but I stopped work for quite a long time and did a master's in theology, ecology and ethics. And I now work maybe a day or two a week to fund the activism. And in fact, I haven't now worked for way over 3 months to do this. The build-up, So that was galvanising, wasn't it? You were galvanised, and the momentum continues. And I did notice you said your background wouldn't lead you to activism. Was that your professional or your faith background, or both? It's all part of who you are, isn't it? A combination of both. I'm a really sort of rational person, and lawyers see both sides of the argument, and so I would never act on my heart. I always act on my head, which actually, in a faith context, can be quite difficult. But that was me. But the other part of it is, I'm not convinced that in church life, in parishes, we enact the radical gospel. So I'd not really heard it, and I certainly wasn't living it. And I think that was the difference.
Thank you. So how has that been lived during the pilgrimage up here, the Camino to COP26? Has it been a sort of countercultural pilgrimage?
Yes, very much so. It's we describe it as an interfaith pilgrimage, but actually the majority of people who walked with us were not of any affiliated faith. Many of them would say they had no faith at all when they started. But it has been an incredibly and intensely spiritual experience. For many of us, we learnt, it was a personal journey. We learnt how to live in community, we learnt how to live more simply. We learnt how to dig quite deep.
Yeah, was that in order to manage the highs and the lows? And were there any specifics that you'd like to say?
So in all honesty, for someone like me who'd never ever done any distance walking, and certainly never done a multi-day expedition, the physical challenge was really tough, and that led me to recognise that actually we, as a society, we don't encourage weakness, or we push people who are weak or vulnerable to the wall, and we see it as something completely undesirable.
I think we tend to celebrate wins and achievements, don't we? But we keep the lesser and the non-achievements quiet, don't we?
And in fact, we almost despise that weakness. It's an individualistic society where we admire strength. And no one will admit their weakness.
Individualistic being the point.
And what we learned was actually, if you're going to live in community and you're going to live in a sense that's really fulfilling, then not only do you have to help other people, but you have to allow them to help you. You have to admit that vulnerability.
So key.
And you become a much better, a leader is not the word, but person who helps other people into their gifts. And all of us were able to do that.
And you became willing to receive from each other, didn't you?
And that was hard. It's really hard to let go of that shell that says, you know, I'm that successful person, and to say,
I'm the giver, not the receiver.
Yes, to receive. That is very.
Well done. Thank you, Melanie. Does anyone else have similar experiences of pilgrimage, of digging deep during a journey, physical or otherwise?
Well, I guess I've had the cycle pilgrimage experience, having cycled from Truro to Paris for COP21, and then subsequently from Paris to Bonn for COP23, and now this time from Truro to Glasgow for COP26.
Was it different each time because you had different number of companions, didn't you?
Yes.
And did you do it alone this time?
I did. Other people weren't able to join me this time.
Sure.
So
you still need those physical resources, don't you? But you don't have the same sort of.
I mean, the funny thing was, I felt they were still with me in spirit, even though they couldn't physically join me, and I also felt so compelled, because having done the previous rides, and with COP being in the UK, I couldn't not go. And I found, in a way, that cycling is a kind of meditation on two wheels. So it was a very levelling experience, and determination to be here. And then on the way, I stopped in each diocese, at each cathedral, and collected their climate declarations, if they had them, and put it together in a portfolio. And I'm hoping to meet Bishop Graham Usher shortly to hand over those declarations, so he can give them to our negotiators and say, look, you know, the church is prepared to do what's necessary. All we need is for you to show more leadership and more radical action.
Yes.
And we'll be there too.
Yes. And for me, this journeying, not having taken part in Camino to COP, but I did 2 days worth with YCCM, has been symbolic of the letting go that we are all doing, as we are all on this journey towards climate justice. And I guess on a pilgrimage you let go of your normal routines when you're living alone, or in the small household that you usually live in, and you let go of creature comforts and ways of being, as we've mentioned. I'm wondering if anyone else here has been part of this Camino. Ishbella, do you know? Okay. No, but I certainly have yet to take part in the Earth Vigil, but it's on my agenda for later today. possibly tomorrow. So
wonderful.
I need to ask you, Melanie, how to get there, if you know.
So the best thing to do is to actually join the Telegram group. I can give you the link.
I've got Helen Burnett's, all her information actually. It's just sort of
because what will happen is the location will change every day. So if you're available at 11, there's a meetup at the Quaker Meeting House, but from there it goes off. And the last couple of days have been out by the gates of the Blue Zone.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
But it may move from there in solidarity with other groups.
Right. Okay.
Tomorrow might be with the Fridays for Future.
Brilliant.
I didn't go on the long walk, but both the 2015 and the relay one, I joined the walk from All Hallows by the Tower in London to Regent's Park, and also I joined at St Martin's in the Field in 2015 for a half day. But what I did find is that the people who are on it, they've got such a strong bond. So the ones, the 2015 people, they all rejoined up here. I saw them at the Vigil. It was quite interesting that they're sort of friends for life kind of thing. And even I know some of them, even though I was only there half a day, you know.
Do you think that bond comes from what you were saying, Melanie, that they may not come from faith backgrounds, but there's this bond that, in a sense, isn't defined by faith, and was that very strong, that bond for you on Camino?
Yes, I think you discover
bonding with the rest of the group.
You discover a new level of love for people. But I think that the people who walked have discovered faith as they went along. It may not be an express faith, but they have a new faith in people and in a connectedness with nature, and sometimes an acknowledgement of some sort of divine spark. You can see people's views changing.
And I wonder whether people did this for themselves or to make a statement to our and other governments, or actually as a sign, as you've already said, of solidarity and saying we're here, we want to be here for as long as it takes to be advocates for those whose voices haven't been heard. Do you think all of those are important reasons?
Different people walk for different reasons, but yes, I think all of them were really important. So for us, travelling along and stopping in each place and doing an outreach event and talking to people about climate justice and about stepping into their own power and stepping up to activism was really important, and getting faith communities particularly to try and engage with this agenda of political action and putting pressure on leaders, because one of the things we talked about was the fact that it's really good to reuse, recycle, and to do the eco-congregation work, the kind of eco-church work, but it's really hard to make good decisions and to do everything if you haven't got the legislation that supports that. And really our job is only half done if we change ourselves. The other half of our job is to exercise some kind of moral leadership.
And do you feel that we don't have to have got it all right ourselves before we do that other half? We can't possibly, can we? So
we live in a world where you have to risk press attention if you do say something and you haven't got it right.
Right.
But the answer is just to say yes. I haven't got it right. I am it is hypocritical.
Work in process. Work in progress. Yes.
Yeah. This is how it is. And still speak out. That's courage. When you're not perfect and you still speak out.
And I think it's that courage and that speaking out that's giving us all hope. There have been a lot of conversations this week already that have been hope-based or have given signs of hope, when at the same time we've not necessarily held optimism, and we talked about the difference, so we're not optimistic. We hear the talk, but we're not sure that our leaders are yet walking the walk.
No, it's really interesting that there's been some promising signs out of these early days of COP, but nothing binding. And if you think back to Paris, it was that same thing, and look at where we are now. And I think our job after COP will be to hold people to account on their words.
That's absolutely, yes. Yeah, that's where our focus will need to be, that accountability.
The interesting thing in 2015 was it was like now, but suddenly on the last day it seemed to change, and there seemed to be something to do with the non-aligned states group and the French foreign minister, but there did something that happened that hadn't. And that's what one hopes, I hope for this time, that something will push people in a group, like this effect of a group, isn't there? On
Well, do you
decisions?
think that the general awareness has grown since Paris? So there may be a sense of more people wanting to hold accountable. But there is still a resistance, both in leadership and in ordinary lifestyle change. People are expected to make lifestyle changes. And the test is whether the awareness is and the intention is strong enough to ride that resistance of lifestyle changes.
I had a strange experience. Before coming here, we'd organised a 48-hour prayer vigil in our church. Many of whom read the Daily Mail and are fairly sort of unenlightened in that sense disposition, but we decided, some of us, that we should have a prayer vigil, and that's the reason I'm a little bit washed out. I haven't walked anywhere, but I've spent a lot of time in a rather cold church praying, and something strange happened to me. A couple of nights ago, I was praying away, and I sort of rather reluctantly thought I ought to start praying for the government, you know, and I suppose I ought to pray for that chap with the tousled hair, and I you know, I had to drag myself into prayer, but suddenly I just found myself weeping for Boris, you know, and I mean, not weeping in a kind of, I don't know, it's a sort of almost like seeing him differently from the way I'm usually seeing him, and praying for him.
Very different forms of prayer here. So you obviously entered that really fully with your emotions and your willingness, Matthew.
Well, I didn't look for the emotion. The emotion overtook me.
You did, but you still entered it.
You don't usually weep in prayer, do you?
No, not usually, no.
Must have been God.
No, I'm not a very emotional person in that sense.
And then there's this active prayer, active in a different sense of actually walking. And how long did the walk take?
56 days. 8 weeks.
Gosh.
And which was the toughest part then? You talked about obviously the physical challenge. Wow.
I'm not used to not having personal space. And every morning having to use the basins in a church bathroom just to get rid of
that really puts proportion on my two days with YCCM. My goodness. And did it get sort of tough for a while and then a bit easier again, physically?
I think physically it did get it. I started thinking that it would be a real chance to connect with the divine, that walking through nature would do that. And it didn't. I was really, really upset for 2 or 3 weeks because I couldn't, you know, that connection which I find in stillness and in sitting in the stillness because of the physical effort of walking. But eventually it came in another way. I think,
did it?
Walking
Yes.
And beauty and just the awe of nature.
So was it an active commitment and obedience and offering, and it was very intentional, wasn't it?
It was a call. I mean, I said this yesterday for the first time we were doing a performance in the green room, and I hadn't really thought about it, but I think it was a calling because you know, why else would someone who was 60 this year and who had never walked anywhere feel that this was the thing to do?
Right.
And then God just put the ways of making it happen before us, you know. It just was, I think it was the right thing.
You followed.
It was a sort of kairos thing. This was
I can't imagine you not keeping in touch with a lot of those people who spend 56 days in such circumstances with people. That would be quite bond forming.
Yes, and many of us do this in faith, so we kind of, there will be opportunities around both, not just Christians, but for the Jews who walk with us and for the Muslims, to take this forward. So we will be. This is not the end.
Absolutely.
This is just the opening of a new chapter.
Yes.
My name's Adrian Shaw. I work with Stephen for supporting Eco Congregation Scotland and Interfaith Scotland. And over the past year we've been helping pilgrims from Germany and Sweden under the title Gate Doch. Just get on with it. Klimapilgern.de website. They started, some of them in Sweden in August, some of them in Poland roughly the same time, walked to Amsterdam, took the ferry to North Shields, where I met them on the 12th of last month, on a really dreich morning. Good soft smør coming in off the North Sea. And they'd been on the boat all night, and they'd been through the misery of UK immigration. They looked a bit miserable and a bit grumpy as we walked up the road in the rain until we arrived at St Cuthbert's primary school. We hear the kids playing in the playground. So we went to the gate. They weren't playing, they were standing in line and cheering. Then we went into the hall, which is marginally bigger than this room as I recall. They were packed in, the tiny ones at the front, the big ones at the back, teachers around, good Catholic school, Oscar Romero quotes on the wall. And they sang their song, which I did beautifully, it was very well rehearsed, and the pilgrims were in tears. They were suddenly emotionally coming in from the rain and feeling grumpy, they were just bang. It was an astonishing experience. So I walked with them that day and met them subsequently on 3 occasions. We've had some difficult times with COVID, getting accommodation. But everywhere I went with them, they were meeting people and greeting people and having just very positive experiences. I tended to walk behind them, giving out leaflets and saying, these people have walked from Germany. And then everybody you spoke to was wow. And there was a connection there, which I thought was remarkable.
Yes.
And we saw it again on Saturday.
You couldn't contrive that connection, could
No.
you?
They walked into Glasgow last Friday. It was an appalling day. Friday last, it just rained, stair rods all day long. Horrible way down Springburn Road, which is grim. Walking basically by the side of the motorway, cars washing over, underpasses flooded, had to cross the road, all that kind of nonsense. Got them into Glasgow Cathedral, where they had a private service. They were sitting there dripping. And that was another magical moment. And on Saturday, you might have been there for the walk from Glasgow Green to George Square.
People we've met this week were, but we travelled up Saturday and Sunday.
Beautifully, we reported on the One show, which was a low point for me because I saw myself in the background stuffing a cheese roll in my face. Just took the shine off all that wonderful spirituality. But they have gone home having had a tough time in many ways, but thinking, what an achievement.
I'm really glad that they did have that ending, that reception, as it were. And Melanie, in my heart and in all our hearts, we were cheering you as it was going on. But did you actually have any, as you came into the overnight places where you stopped, did you have any greetings like that?
In some,
yes.
We received the warmest welcome everywhere in cake.
Yeah,
cake was the hallmark.
But you walked it off the next day.
and all of it sort of home baked, and people would cook meals for us. And just the love we received.
That's community as well, isn't it? That's meaningful.
And meeting the school children was really important because we've got letters back from many of the schools and the brownie groups and things like that, just saying that their children were so inspired by this and by talking about how our faith led us to this.
I think that's great because intergenerational conversations are so important, and I just do a little bit of voluntary work with Cubs and Scouts, but we've encouraged conversations between children who really want to take up some of these issues and talk to their parents about whether they buy plastic wrapped products or not, where they buy their food, what food they buy, and what food miles are added, and that it's really good to enthuse children and adults and get those conversations going, isn't it?
One of the most important conversations that I think we had was actually not with children. We had the wonderful opportunity to meet a small academy chain in Birmingham. We met the head teachers and the head of the academy chain. We talked to them about how their young people really understood what was going on and were, feeling quite grieved by this, but they were particularly grieved by how the adults in their lives were responding to it and the dissonance they felt between being taught one thing in their RE lessons and their geography lessons and then watching how the adults in their lives lived their own lives and how their schools still weren't sourcing their dinners and had plastic cups at the water fountain and how angry, but
well, I sort of see that as the motivation for Greta. Have you met Greta, or will you need to?
Yeah.
So I feel that was her motivation.
Yeah. And we have to remember that children learn experientially. If we tell them one thing, actually what they're learning is what they see, not what we talk to them about. And so it's a chance to sort of explore with teachers that you can't do that. It's not fair on children. And actually, it will create generational mental health issues if we say to them, this is how it should be, but this is really weird.
I wonder whether any issues will come up in education now that we do have the scientific evidence, which we didn't have 30 years ago, about the impact of climate change. Is this going to be taught? I hope it is. Just as evolution was eventually taught, but at first there was resistance to it being included in the curriculum. Pardon?
I was thought about climate
change.
Oh, right,
okay, well,
25 years ago.
25 years ago, yeah.
They've been teaching for years, and this is part of the issue. You teach it academically, and then you don't live it.
Right. Yeah.
There are some powerful vested interests. Highly commend a book which got me into a lot of trouble when I wrote about it, by Michael Taylor, just published, called The Interest. And what he does is examine why in the 1780s and 1790s everybody agreed slavery was wrong. It took until 1830 to abolish it. The conclusion he came to, there was a very powerful business, financial and government interest in keeping it going. 200 years later, almost exactly, we knew about climate change in the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher addressed the United Nations in 1989, simply talking about this. Now here we are in 2021, and it's still, the radical action has not taken place. Is there the same set of vested interests? The oil companies are now being exposed. So I point out one really bad lot is house builders. Continuing to build boxes that are nowhere near passive house, do not have low carbon energy heating systems. They've been doing it for 20, 30 years. They have stubbornly refused to change. It's making too much money out of it now. How is that? Why is that? How is that interest prevented what we know to be necessary from happening?
And there's a big gap between the rhetoric and the greenwash and what's actually they're actually doing.
In fact, house building is a particularly bad case because they managed to lobby the government into reducing the regulatory framework, which wasn't good enough in the first place, but is now incredibly weak. So we've gone backwards in that.
Still, compared to slavery, that blog was taken down.
By who?
It was for Housing Quality Network, which is a consultancy. And somebody objected to it. I wasn't actually saying they were like slave owners, I was saying there's a vested interest that seems to be similar to that stopped action on slavery 200 years ago.
And
is there a parallel?
Who was Michael Taylor? Was he the same Michael Taylor that you...
He's a historian.
Yes.
The book is called The Interest. Highly recommend. It's a great read.
Thank you, Aileen.
I think that link between our situation just now and the practice of slavery and the process of the abolition of, and then subsequent time has so many parallels. And I don't see that. So I'm interested in James McCune Smith, who was the first African American to get an official medical degree. It was at Glasgow University, and so he was paid to come over by churches, and his degree was done, and he did a master's, and then he was set up back in New York, and he was the first black pharmacist in America, and all that, etc. And I just don't see that love that meant that it was churches that were leading in that movement in the same way. Although the Zika congregation, that's we talk about radicalism, and that there's I see the get rid of plastic cups, but I don't see that like the radicalism. What is being on the other side of that barrier? There is, to a certain extent, the status quo is so strong, and I think that you were talking about crying for Boris Johnson. I think we all have to get there. I think everybody has to to cry. Like everybody has to get to the stage where, like I'm reading again, William Blake talking about actually living the Bible would get a man hanged, and I think we're still in that place. If you actually, and that's what Greta as well, like Greta Thunberg, she talks about her autism being part of the reason, like her superpower, because she sees it and she says, that's wrong. And she doesn't go, well, there's lots of reasons why someone might do this. She just says, that's wrong. And she can see other people having the same, and then kind of moulding themselves to society.
And it's that, I guess it's that crying in love and anger that means those barriers of injustice are surmounted, and just as those barriers were surmounted for James McEwen Smith, they need to be. I mean, we could talk about calling out truth to the powers, but we need to dismantle those barriers or overcome them.
Totally, and I think I felt like I became an environmentalist sort of 10-15 years ago because I was a Christian, and I felt that I remember reading the two stories of creation that are in the Bible, and this idea of care. You know, there's a story of sort of mastery and a story of care, and I felt like we were kind of living both, and I wanted to go down one route, but that didn't. The sort of radical, what does that mean for like the whole system has been so slow, and it's that sort of intersectional Black Lives Matter combined with all of this ableism of what is it to push weakness to the side, and then pushing weakness to the side is the same as saying, we have to have continual growth because growth is strength, but all of these things are just so in, and how do you just have to pull that up?
And people have just bought into that unknowingly, unwittingly. And we talked earlier in the week about Jesus and the rich young ruler who had done all the right things, but then wouldn't go just a bit further and sell his possessions. But Jesus loved him, or in that translation it says he loved him, so he had compassion for him. And perhaps the crying for Boris Johnson was similar, was the compassion and what can we do compassionately, but without watering it all down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it is huge. If you act in love, if you actually, you hear stories in history of the things that people have done and to act so far, they are terrible. like awesome, and all of those old-fashioned words. That's the level.
Reckless love, even.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to ask Melanie the question, but I wanted to ask Melanie the question, which is, I'm just saying it myself. I told you I did a half day in 2015 and a half day in 2000. If you'd have said, oh, I'll go for a week and see how I get on, did you have to decide I'm going to do the lot at the beginning, or did you say, oh, I'll see how I get on? Do you understand what I mean? In terms of the decision and being able to complete the path, was it important that you decided I'll walk all the way, whatever happens, something like that?
I had actually thought I wouldn't walk all the way, so I knew I'd needed to do it all because I was on the organising team. So I knew I needed to be. But I didn't think I was capable of walking the 500 miles. And I had announced quite firmly that I would be riding some of it.
Yeah. That's amazing, well done.
And I think that what happens is when you take the first step, then you get that power and that courage to do more.
That's so encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
You look remarkably well in it.
I think it's probably a very healthy lifestyle. Apart from anything else, we ate loads of beans. We carried dried lentils and things with us anywhere that we weren't cooked before. But we were a vegan because one of the things is that we were trying to model the sort of life that people, the communities of resilience and the way people will need to live.
In solidarity.
Well, not just in solidarity, but also as a way of showing that it is possible to do this, and so we know that meat is one of the big carbon emission. Thing. But also, some of this climate change is built in. We have to face it. We have to know how to live with it.
Yes.
And so, so we ate a lot of beans.
Yay. I'm going to stop recording. Thank you.